Today's episode is brought to you by Create Engage, the specialist digital marketing agency for the disruptive management consultancy. Now, for long-time listeners, you will probably already know who we are. You may have even heard one of our ads on a previous episode of this podcast. But for those of you who don't, here is a short introduction. At Create Engage, we help you create an effective marketing strategy for your consultancy, a strategy that will resonate with your target clients. And then we support you by delivering the campaigns you need to turn that strategy into a reality, helping you to build your brand, raise your profile with your prospective clients, and ultimately generate return on investment from your marketing activity. Now, I could tell you about many of the great clients that we work with and the results we've delivered for them. But instead, I'm going to do something much more powerful and something that I would recommend you do for your own marketing. I'm going to let our clients do the talking for us. If you are currently thinking about marketing for your consultancy, you're going to want to listen to this.
Create Engage started the process for us. They managed it end to end. They came up with some really creative ideas and we were really happy with the work that they did, which meant that we could just focus on running the business. Not only did we start conversations with clients that we hadn't spoken to before, but also there was tangible return on investment by some work that we were given.
They've helped right from the initial shaping of the idea through to helping us work out what our end goal was. They've supported us with the visual identity and our positioning of the brand.
We've had an immediate expansion of our network and have initiated a raft of new conversations with owners, CEOs in target client organisations, and has led to us winning new projects already.
One of the greatest compliments, I guess, is that one of our competitors even said that they really like what we're doing with marketing and they wish they could be doing something as good.
So from our perspective, we couldn't recommend Create Engage any more than this.
I would certainly recommend Create Engage if you're a consulting firm. They really understand consultancies and the sort of challenges we face. And I don't think you're going to get much better marketing anywhere else.
So I wouldn't hesitate to recommend Create Engage. They did a really good job for us.
So if you're looking for an agency that can help you achieve the results that our clients just described, then head to our website, createengage.co.uk, where you can find out more about how we support consulting firms like you. You can download our latest ebook and you can get in touch to talk about how we can help you take your consultancy to the next level through digital marketing. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Climate Consulting. In this one, I chat with Peter Reid, founder and CEO at MSQ. Pete started his career in consulting, firstly with an entrepreneurial boutique that had arrived in the UK from the US, and then went on to a successful 4-year stint at McKinsey. Having seen consulting and the consulting life wasn't for him, he changed direction. And having found Media Square, which saw him cut his teeth in the relatively new world of digital marketing as it was then, he co-founded MSQ, seeing a gap and a need from brands for smarter and simpler agency relationships. Fast forward to today, and he is now the global CEO of MSQ, overseeing the UK's fastest growing marketing network with 1,200 employees working across 13 global offices. In this conversation, we discuss a whole host of fascinating topics. We talk about Pete's early career, that time in consulting, and the key lessons that he learned from McKinsey. We explore actually what led Pete to co-found MSQ and how MSQ's acquisition strategy has turbocharged their growth, both here in the UK and overseas. We explore culture and actually how you build a culture as you grow a business through acquisition and how you maintain that at both a group level and within the individual agencies underneath that. And finally, we talk about sustainability, diversity, and inclusion. Key passions for Pete, for MSQ, and we explore Pete's advice for actually how you can approach these in your organization to deliver real change. This was a hugely wide-ranging conversation and really does have something in it for everyone. Whether you are just starting out in consulting and you want to find out about the different types of firms you could work at, or maybe you are at the other end, you're leading a consultancy and you're thinking about moving into the world of M&A and what that means for your firm, there is going to be something in here for you. So with the intro done, all that's left to say is please enjoy today's conversation with Peter Reid. Pete, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to see you.
I'm looking forward to this. I know we caught up just before Christmas at your office. We've just had a great lunch, and I know we're going to touch on some of the topics we spoke about over that today. But for those who don't know you, it would be great if you could kick off with a bit of your background and how you got to the role you've got at MSQ and what you're doing today.
Sure. So I think those who do probably know more about kind of McKinsey and MSQ, but actually I started off very much in a more entrepreneurial setting. So after university, I joined the startup office of a medium-sized US consultancy, which was called Simpsons at the time, very focused in kind of strategic human capital, for want of an American phrase. But that was a great experience for 3-4 years in terms of there were 4 of us when we started. So probably just got more exposure than I might have done somewhere else. Elsewhere, grew it to about 24, 25 people in 2-3 years, but then decided to go to business school. So had a great year at INSEAD, actually mainly in Singapore because I'd spent some time in France beforehand, and then the last 4 months in the forest of Fontainebleau, just outside Paris. And there actually I got while at INSEAD, got the job at McKinsey in London. So then spent sort of really best part of 4 years, very much focused on the media and telecom space. And then as that time kind of evolved, actually, particularly in the media PE space. So that kind of got me particularly interested in the sort of turnaround, transformation sort of type work. And then ultimately, which we kind of might come back to a bit later on, I sort of decided I wanted to get a proper job, and then hence moved into business called Media Square, which is kind of what then became MSQ.
Well, there is a lot for us to cover there, Pete, not least what strategic human capital actually means.
Absolutely. I'm still working on it.
I do find the same after over 10 years in consulting. When someone says, what does a consultant do? I don't yet have the elevator pitch, but I'm not sure if anyone does. But that is quite a start. And I think we could start right at the beginning, but I almost, to your point, you teed me up for it around McKinsey. Just because obviously the brand name is so well known, I'd be really keen to start there because I think we're going to come on to your sort of entrepreneurial side when we move into the MSQ journey. And I guess I'd be really fascinated, how you found your time there, and almost looking back, what were some of those key skills McKinsey gave you? Because you obviously had a great consulting background. Was it Simpsons you called it? So you said. So you could have gone anywhere in consulting after that. But McKinsey obviously has quite an aura and name. Actually, for anyone listening who's thinking about doing that as a career step, what were the biggest things you learned there? What was it that you still sort of carry today and helps you today?
No, it's a really interesting question. I guess just to put it in a bit of context, I think what I was interested in, when I took the job, ultimately probably because of the brand and the development opportunities down the line, being completely honest. But what I found when I first joined there was actually the experience was slightly different than I expected. And it is very much, it's a firm of multiple cultures. There's not a kind of unitary culture, although there are things that run across it and definitely some consistent threads. But it's really about a mixture of cultures by office and by even individuals within the office. And that wasn't particularly what I was expecting, but it kind of really helped me navigate through kind of almost a coping mechanism through the time, and meant that actually, I did genuinely really enjoy it whilst also learning stuff. And the other thing that might surprise people, and again, this is different a little bit by office within the firm, was actually it's kind of much more fun than you might expect. It can be relentless, but actually there is quite a big emphasis on, not only community, but also getting people together out of work, both sort of training and sort of beyond training, sort of external trips and stuff. So those pieces are a bit of a surprise. But to your kind of main question, I guess probably the biggest thing, maybe a great surprise that I learned, was probably actually around client centricity. I think it's a great point across all professional service firms. But if I look across even MSQ now, I think that if there's something that people could really benefit from having spent some time there, it is that kind of client first focus, but also all the things that go with that, including attention to detail might be an overplayed concept sometimes, but kind of having that standard set, I think has been hugely valuable, and kind of haven't been able to completely kind of get rid of finding like spaces in PowerPoints and things like that. But then I suppose alongside that, really this sort of skill that's now been most transferable is the fact that you do kind of hone your ability to kind of cut through a bunch of data, a bunch of themes, a bunch of interviews, and really kind of pick up on what are the key topics or what are the key implications. And I've found that in terms of kind of working with clients, which I still do occasionally, but in particular actually just sort of general management, just being able to cut through the noise and then focus on the key bits. It's an obvious skill in a way, but I think it's still hugely valuable overall. And I guess, again, sometimes sort of maybe less expected. I think there's a huge amount of focus within McKinsey on kind of managing people, both within your own teams and managing clients. How do you motivate people and that kind of thing? And I've definitely taken away lots of pieces from there as well.
That's a great roundup. And yes, I think if you've ever been a consultant, you can never look at a PowerPoint the same.
No.
You always notice, it drives my team crazy when the only thing I notice is a misaligned box on what is otherwise a very beautiful and informative PowerPoint presentation.
Absolutely. And my thing I'm trying to let go of is that sort of when you do have an abbreviation of IE, you put a comma after the second full stop, which is definitely a bridge too far.
Well, maybe for after this, we'll talk all about our consulting isms because, I think our listeners are probably feeling the same. And I think they're fascinating, actually, to hear you around, particularly around the culture side and also the fun, because you're right. I haven't worked at McKinsey, but the sense you get is it's long hours, hard work, but you get a good badge at the end of it. And hearing that fun piece is quite interesting. I just curious how you mentioned you learned to navigate those cultures. Is that something, given your previous role and your time at business school, like you'd kind of been trained to do, or was that a bit of a baptism of fire? How did you approach that? Because like you say, you hear about McKinsey, but London must be very different to Paris, and even what you said, in practices are so different. How did you navigate that?
Yeah, it's good. I think just my first experience was actually really helpful in terms of just, number one, really helping you think about what did I enjoy about sort of almost day-to-day working, and what did I want out of a career in terms of a more practical rather than a kind of long-term strategic goal point of view. And, even at Simpsons, it's probably the place where, I was sort of talking to one of my kids the other day that, I definitely had to do the odd all-nighter there, which I'm quite glad I don't do now. But I guess it also made me realize that I'm sort of, I'm continue to work hard, and sometimes wish it's slightly less hard, but I didn't want to be working 100-hour weeks, 7 days a week as a sort of an engagement manager or later on in a career. And what was pretty key to me in the McKinsey is you're going to have to work hard, but actually the choices you make about the sectors you work with, the partners you work with, as in any organization, there are different partners who probably value the kind of work ethic and the output kind of, more than the kind of the balance. And similarly, there are also alongside that, there were kind of specific strategies when you finished a really intense engagement, because sometimes they were, make sure you kind of take a little bit of time off in between, and ideally book 2 days off in the middle of the following week, because then you've got 2 weeks when you probably can't be staffed on engagement. So it was probably a combination of just having the right approach on the way in, and then similarly just knowing what little things you did to kind of make your kind of experience kind of on a practical level more valuable. But as I say, for me, it's always very much a horses for courses, because there are other people who worked in the retail practice, which was very much known for sort of great impacts, great clients, but it was full on. And, a lot of people really valued that, did that for a few years and got great experience from doing so.
I think some great advice, not least the book the day off or 2 days off the week after. So you in effect get 2 weeks on the bench, which is always nice. And I think that balance is really important. I know my career in consulting was quite short, and for a similar reason to what you suggest is I probably pushed it too hard too quickly, because as a young 20-something, you want to make partner and you figure you should just blast it to get there. And you quickly find out that you can't do that for 10 years, or some people can. But I think to your point, that kind of balance and finding the partners that resonate with you is probably something really useful for others listening as well. And this might be a nice segue into MSQ, because I know that McKinsey was the first introduction to brand strategy and work that we would now consider marketing, but I think at the time you were doing under a sort of strategy and a consulting lens. And I'd be really keen to, I guess, hear about some of those sort of early projects. And maybe this is taking us back to bring us forward, but obviously now running MSQ, you and your team have done hundreds of these projects. It's probably slightly different. Actually, what was it about those early projects that you kind of learned? And also, what did you carry forward that maybe now you've changed, and actually as a world, we look at that sort of branding quite differently?
Yeah, I think the probably the biggest piece I found, did a lot of, as you say, maybe strategic marketing and organizational pieces, and they were kind of interesting, and actually sort of learning a little bit about where you can flex things and where you perhaps trying to be too consistent can be a mistake, like kind of pricing and things like that. But actually the bit that I found really interesting for the future was when you got into things that were more into brand and sort of that end of marketing, where I'm kind of obviously much more involved now. And what I found interesting was the fact that there was absolutely a kind of place in data, and sort of, certainly at the time, McKinsey were up there with anyone in terms of producing the kind of the data-driven, insight-centric strategy strategy, the most perfect sort of advanced segmentation strategy. But then when you went into sort of starting to talk about brand and then particularly how engaging people, it was still the same kind of more left brain style approach. And even though I've learned a lot more about that now, and I was possibly guilty of some of the same things, you could sort of see, particularly when you then had other experts in the room and people were from the agency world, that it didn't actually kind of, have that real emotional connection with consumers and with clients, etc., that you kind of needed. So even when still at McKinsey, I sometimes felt that the kind of fees for those type of marketing engagements we were being charged was probably not really going to be justified by the outcomes coming on the back of it. Interestingly, now you kind of have the other problem where I think oftentimes you're able to deliver a much more actionable and possibly better product, but you're not be able to charge anything like the same amount of money for it.
Yes, it is the age-old challenge of perceived value, and I guess also having the McKinsey logo helps with fee charge-out rates as well, doesn't it?
100%, and who you're talking to in the organisation as well.
Oh, definitely. Well, I think, Pete, that gives us a nice bridge to actually go on to the MSQ journey, and as you know, we've had Ben on this show, your colleague who leads MMT, and Ben gave me the story after he joined, and obviously we focused a lot on the MMT journey, but maybe it's like Star Wars, maybe it's not. We've got a prequel, and then we've also got the sequel and where it's gone since then. And I'd love to start that piece by getting the journey after McKinsey. So actually, how did the Media Square opportunity come about, and take us on that journey up to that Be Heard acquisition, and then we can dive into the details.
Absolutely. Yeah. So really, I found myself, which I think probably a lot of people in consulting kind of reached that point. I was sort of 3.5 years into the journey. I'd been sort of project manager for sort of probably 3 years of that sort of time. And I was kind of on the one hand thinking about, did I want to stay and, be a partner, sort of senior partner in sort of McKinsey, or did I want to do something different? There were probably kind of, I guess, two things for me. That firstly, I looked at the kind of the forward at least 3 or 4 years, and I wasn't sure actually the partner experience was all it was kind of cracked up to be. I could see the real benefits of when you got to director level and senior partner level, but that was potentially 8-9 years of kind of doing the same thing and kind of hard work to kind of get there. And that was quite an important realization. And I think, personally, I'd always advise people just actually sort of, step back a bit and think about, I'm not, yes, it may be the normal career track, but is that absolutely what you want to do? Is it right? Is it kind of right for you? So I kind of had a little bit of that. And as we were talking earlier, I probably also found that one of the things I'd loved in consulting was the variety. And I still had variety in terms of projects, but I did feel increasingly I was doing similar things kind of over again. So that also led me to think that actually I really wanted to try something that was not kind of consulting or a continuation of consulting, and was, as I sort of jokingly said earlier, a real job, but actually more in the kind of line management and etc. And I suppose probably at the time that I probably knew more about what I didn't want to do. So say I knew at that point I didn't really want to kind of stay the course at McKinsey, and frankly being more focused on pure media was probably a harder thing to do anyway. But then secondarily, I kind of, what a lot of people, probably the classic sort of move out of McKinsey is to go and do corporate strategy for a big organization for 3 years. And for me, that was having advised a lot of those teams, that was probably my definition of hell versus even staying kind of where I was. So I started looking for something that was much more at the more entrepreneurial end. And interestingly, I think that sort of time at Simpsons was probably quite influential in some of that. And as it turned out, there was a guy called Roger Parry who sort of had done a lot in the sort of media on the more entrepreneurial side, but also sort of chairman of FTSE 100 companies at the time. Johnson Press shows how far things have changed, and now sort of chairman of YouGov. And he was really embarking on a bit of a kind of transformation program at Media Square, and asked me to come and join him to help him do so. That was sort of back into 2007. And I guess, in that time, I didn't plan to sort of spend, sort of certainly not sort of 17 years sort of doing a similar thing. But I really quickly could see that while there were a few things in other parts of the group that needed to change, you could see there were these agencies that had real potential, albeit that they also needed a bit of rebuilding. And a lot of them had been second or third generation management, having kind of sold into the business. But you felt actually there was something to really build on. And probably most importantly, I kind of really liked the people. And, even going back to that time, and we maybe talk about it a bit more, we had people who were, there was a nice culture to it, but also most of them were instinctively collaborative. And that felt like you had a really big building block to actually kind of build behind it.
I really like the frame, and we will come back to culture, Pete, because I think to your point around enjoying consulting, wanting to do a proper job, but also have that variety. It feels like you stumbled across the perfect role in that you were still consulting with these different agency brands within Media Square, but like you say, you had kind of the line role as well. And I think because this is very interesting for our consulting listeners, also anyone from a marketing sphere who's listening, but you mentioned around actually these agency brands, you could see potential, they needed some change. What were the commonalities? Because I think in any services business, there are sort of certain levers you can pull to make those improvements. In those early days, what were the things that you were fixing to help get those agencies back on track?
I think sometimes it's hard to generalize, but actually in many cases, there really are lessons that you can learn and apply. And, while they were at different stages of development, etc. In simple terms, in most cases, it was starting to be very clear on what is the right proposition for that individual agency or capability. And then secondarily, making sure you had the right team at the top. So particularly you're kind of, getting the right, particularly CEO, MD in place, and then getting the right creative directors, planning directors, and getting them all aligned, behind the proposition, but also the strategy. Those were probably the two biggest things. And then kind of on maybe a more practical level, I think, most businesses and professional services, but certainly in agencies, if there's either 10 or 11 of you, or you've got one client who's 80% of the business, it's not a great place to kind of, be starting from, particularly the latter. So there was then a little bit of kind of structural stuff, which you can't always fix over time, to really kind of try and add some scale and a bit more sort of structure to or substance to the agencies as well.
A lot to dig into there. And again, because I'm thinking, we're going to talk about sort of acquisitions shortly, but we talked over lunch. The agency world has always been, I think, a bit ahead of the consulting world, but the consulting world is catching up with this. And that piece of offering and leadership team are fascinating to an extent of people will think they know what their offering is, but it's only when you actually grill it that you really dig in. But also, I think leadership team is quite a challenge, because particularly if you mentioned third generation management, but I assume it's the same throughout, of the leadership team is such an important part of an agency or consulting firm. How do you sort of approach that balance? Chicken and egg, what comes first? Do you shape the agency offering and then find the leadership team to deliver it? Do you have to get the leadership team in and then find the offering? Because that feels so intrinsic to success. If you haven't got a right offering and a right leadership team, I don't think you're going to go anywhere.
I think that's right. And I will give you a sort of a response, but it is really an iterative process around it. But what I think we tried to do was at least not try and nail the proposition, but be clear on what the agency was about and the space that it operated in. Because at the time, and I think it was happening quite a lot across the space, there was probably a little bit too much about trying to be all things to all men or all people. And that didn't feel quite the right sort of solution. And so we'd almost try and be clear, actually, are we focusing here on digitally enabled CRM? Or are we trying to be an integrated agency? Then I think you really had to get the kind of leadership in place, and it had to be, they had to really develop the actual proposition and kind of ultimately own the proposition. Otherwise, it probably wasn't going to work either.
Yeah, well, it's a great point. I think that niche piece, because time and again, and it's the same in agency land as it is in consulting, as that there feels like an upside to saying we are all thing to all men and women and people, that we can do everything shop, whereas actually, as as MSQ's shown and other businesses, that niche is important. And take me on the journey, because obviously, as we were chatting about over lunch, I know a bit about, and my listeners who, if you haven't, you should go back and listen to Ben's episode, will have heard some of the Be Heard story. But you started with a number of agencies, and I understand actually there was a combination of organic growth and inorganic. And I'd be interested at kind of what point organic was the larger, at what point inorganic, and equally the decision to flip that, if there was a decision.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there was, and there were definitely periods of focusing on both. I mean, ultimately, and really going back to sort of 2011, 2012, when we actually founded properly MSQ, took the business private with those agencies, we were much more focused on the sort of marketing side of the house rather than now our kind of blend between really kind of tech and creativity. And so in that kind of context, what we thought, well, actually, there really was here still an opportunity to, over time, challenge challenge the holding companies. And we knew we had a lot more work to be done. It wasn't an overnight piece, but one of the real advantages we had was that we were all fused in digital and we didn't have a big consumer broadcast ad agency. And it was relatively clear, albeit it wasn't going to change overnight, that kind of having that more digital mindset, whether it was in PR, frankly, or in kind of CRM or in sort of big ticket advertising, was going to become an advantage, even if it wasn't necessarily an advantage in sort of January 2012. So that was the sort of premise. And as I say, for the first, probably really the first sort of 6 or 7 years, the main focus was on organic growth. And I always stay and continue to say that the best way to grow any agency, and I think broadly any professional service firm, is still organic growth on the back of particularly new business and new clients. And so that's always been our mantra. But in those early days, it was almost that actually you needed to kind of create the right platform, and you needed the real opportunities was to, as I say, prove the proposition, get the management team in place, get the strategy right, and then build that kind of sense of cohesion kind of across the group. And from a sort of more subsequently, from a pure value creation point of view, it was reasonably clear we actually kind of got to a point where we had a decent level of revenue, but actually the margin probably was slightly lacking to where it should be. And we kind of, our first view was to kind of ultimately create value in the business. The simplest straight line to doing that was to focus on actual mix between organic growth and sort of, really margin improvement mainly through growth, frankly, by building scale, but also with a little bit of operational improvement on the back of it. And we were quite lucky in terms that we actually had we've always had quite a nice international footprint, even though it's, been relatively small. So we were able to kind of push into Asia because we already had the offices there to build on the back of it, and similar in the US. So actually pretty early on, we were able to move into China and sort of really grew a presence there, sort of similarly in Singapore and to some extent in New York. So it wasn't just about organic growth in the UK winning clients. It was also kind of organic growth on the back of clients in other areas as well. So that was really the prime way of operating until sort of 2017, 2018, albeit through that time, we had done acquisitions probably as far back as 2009. From memory, we bought 2 businesses and sold 1 business in between 2012 and 2019. So it wasn't a huge amount. It was very much kind of secondary, albeit that it laid the foundations for the future. I guess really when we got to sort of 2018, 2019, and we were bringing LDC in as a new investment partner, what had become really clear was some of the stuff I said at the beginning was that, whereas in 2012, not having a big consumer ad agency, but having digital skills was almost a disadvantage, albeit you could see the potential, the world had really come towards us and the business was in a much better state. So you really saw actually the opportunity was really to realize that kind of vision of becoming over 3 to 5 years an alternative kind of holding company. And to do that, particularly you would need to build scale from where we were. And that's kind of both in the UK and internationally. So that was a kind of key piece. There was probably a little bit of a secondary piece. I'm not going to lie that kind of, having more access to investment kind of probably helps and encourages you. But I think as a general rule, and there are no general rules, that, you don't want to be trying to do a load of acquisitions while you're trying to sort of sort the house out. And in the same way of kind of, merging or buying, sort of merging 2 businesses that are in trouble was, in my experience, is a difficult thing to do well. So there was a little bit about kind of getting that done. And, the nice thing was that period between 2014, when we brought in the first private equity buyer, in 2019, even with the solely organic structure, we took the share price from 20p to £20. So it had a level of success kind of on the back of it. But we then realized kind of we wanted to go again. And without replaying too much of kind of Ben's sort of podcast, I mean, we throughout that period had lots of conversations. I'd known Ben for a long time. And so we'd actually probably every couple of years had some sort of conversation, and paths had gone a different way, but we were already kind of ready to kind of make that move. And sort of what was perhaps surprising to me, particularly when you put COVID in the mix as well, was that how quickly, having brought in a new private equity investor, we were able to buy another public company that was roughly 2/3 of our size in lockdown, and etc. And that's probably a topic for another day.
Well, I think we'll see how we go today, because doing a deal that's 2/3 of your size in lockdown, getting everyone comfortable over Zoom is probably a whole nother conversation. I'm going to come on to some of the things you touched on there, Pete, but you dangled the carrot, so I've got to ask about it. That 20p to £20, I mean, that's a decent return on any spectrum of time. And you were saying that's sort of achieved in, was it 5, 6 years, give or take?
5 years, yeah.
And We've touched on a couple of the areas around proposition, around leadership team. I also appreciate I'm about to ask you something that is trying to simplify what's a whole load of things into a small answer. But actually, what were the drivers that enabled that? Was there anything else that stood out? Because my maths is failing me, but that's about 1,000 times growth. Is that not?
That was about that, yeah. Albeit from a small starting point. So
it helps in some ways, but a small stone gathers pace slowly when you roll it downhill usually. I mean, you mentioned also that sense of cohesion across the group. I mean, was it those three things that let you achieve that rapid, that significant growth? Or was there anything else looking back that you're like, actually, that was one of the big unlocks? Because that's phenomenal growth for anyone.
You just alluded to it. I think the only thing that didn't specifically talk about was actually by being private business and then subsequently having private equity backing, I think made a massive difference to us. If I come back to sort of 2012, we needed to take a medium-term view on these. And if we'd have had quarterly targets, even though the bottom of AIM, you probably don't have that anymore, it would have been a harder thing to do, but probably more fundamentally enabled us to actually create what we've called the MSQ shareholder manager scheme, which in many ways I kind of, I didn't at the time, but I sort of now feel was a bit ahead of its time when I hear like someone like Sorrell saying, oh, we've got to adopt the private equity view of incentivization. That's broadly what we exactly what we put in place sort of back then. And what that did overnight was actually transform the type of people that we could talk to from a recruitment kind of point of view, not just from the value creation point of view, but being able to give people a sense of ownership and sort of stake in the group was something particularly back then was very rare. And I think without that, I don't think we would have got the quality of people that we were able to get, which, even then, we were able to bring in some really high quality people, probably at times beyond my expectations. And I think that was a fundamental part of doing that. And then the kind of from a retention and motivation point of view, it also helped.
Interesting. And just so I'm clear and for my listeners, that share scheme, I mean, in essence, you're giving equity upside to those people. So like you're saying, people who might have been, you might not have been able to attract purely on salary terms. You actually had that long-term view of, well, join us, you get equity that will grow 1,000 times over that, that journey. Was that the crux of what let you hire that great talent?
Yeah, I think it was certainly a critical piece of it. And certainly the description, you're absolutely right. I mean, with sort of all of our senior people actually own specific shares. It's not a share option scheme, which is a semantic, but I think an important difference. So they kind of buy the shares and then they kind of have that sense of ownership. I think that was critical to doing that. I think it was, but for me, it was the combination of the sort of that financial piece and then the kind of the non-financial piece. And that we always kept this kind of entrepreneurial framework to the business. I used to talk a lot about entrepreneurial autonomy in that relative to at least sort of more network agencies, larger agencies, there was fast decision making, just that more collaborative entrepreneurial feel, albeit in a little bit of a kind of group structure. And I think a lot of people really valued the combination of the two. And perhaps if they weren't maybe ready to do a pure startup, they could see the kind of there's almost the financial upside, but also the kind of non-financial attractions as well.
I'm going to hold on this, and we'll come back to acquisitions in a minute. It will weave, because it was something I wanted to ask you about the model, because obviously you, as a brand, you are MSQ, you go to market, but as we know, we know Ben, we work with MMT. There is also the kind of individual agency brands, and actually, to your point around that sort of entrepreneurial spirit, how do you make that work when I guess you've got to balance a combination of tensions, don't you? Of each person is to an extent going to want to get their business to grow and succeed. You also want cohesion across the group. You're going to market as a holding company, as a group, and as individual brands. How do you square all of that to give you all of the upsides, I guess, without the downsides that can come with it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant question. I guess some of this I probably would say I've learned over the last couple of years, as well as some of them longer term. I mean, I think the fundamental point, which sounds obvious when you say it, but I think people don't always apply, is that creating a unitary brand does not create a unitary culture. And I look at the last few years, the businesses like Ogilvy and Engine in the sort of more marketing communications space, who've kind of thought, well, the way to kind of simplify and bring people together is to kind of create a single brand. And I think, on that level, it's largely failed because they haven't actually created the unified culture. So what we've always tried to do is the other way around. And I think that, the first point is that actually, I think tension is actually not a bad thing if it's recognized and managed. And even on a practical level, I've always said, and this is probably more of a personal view, and it's sort of not 100% probably shared by even all the management team, is that actually someone who's working in smarts or consumer PR agency agency, if they're deciding between a kind of new business opportunity that's an MSQ-led opportunity, which is kind of, needs some collaboration, and kind of continue to develop sort of our work with Johnny Walker or Zalando on a pan-European basis, in a sense, you've always got to make some choices between how you allocate your time. And if ultimately you think your incentives are better served by focusing on stuff on your own agency, I've not really had a problem with that, as long as they communicate that appropriately, don't do that all the time, etc. So I find that tension actually quite helpful in many ways. But then the big things that we've done and we did from an early stage is just particularly in your senior parts of your leadership teams and agency teams, you've got to have people whose instinct is to collaborate. And if you don't have that, even if they're fantastically sort of high performers, it's going to infect the rest of the culture. So, we did make some reasonably tough decisions early on. In some cases, it was a self-selecting thing. It wasn't entirely on our side, where you had people actually were running successful agencies well, but they weren't the right people to kind of fit into that kind of duality and sort of the model that we have, which fundamentally is about offering clients flexibility and choice, not imposing our own model on clients, assuming they all want one different thing, which certainly in marketing is probably the biggest mistake that people make overall. So no, it was really about kind of, if you get people who are kind of like-minded and want to collaborate, build relationships across people across time, and then more latterly we built more as we got bigger, more structures around it. So certainly having all the capabilities under one roof in a single office, sort of having more internal engagements that kind of go across agencies, these all make a big difference as well. So, I think where we've ended up is actually, I think we've got a far more unified culture than pretty much any sort of, multidisciplinary or kind of multi-agency group that I kind of come across, but we still have the kind of strengths from a kind of go-to-market point of view.
It's fascinating. And your point on culture, and we will come on to that later, because I think your point of you've got to have the right people at the top who embody that spirit, because if you don't, you can put all the schemes and structures in place you want, but if those people leading those agencies and key accounts don't want to collaborate in that way, you've lost. And I think that this is very much, given our audience is consulting, I think there's something interesting in this model for our audience of, you highlighted you needed to grow these capabilities, and so you acquired agencies. And I think you've been in the consulting world as well as I have. The typical consulting response is, I'll hire a partner. So, similar construct, there'll be an equity element, but I'll hire a partner and the partner will build the team. And I think you're probably one of the only guests I've ever had who sat both sides of the kind of consulting and marketing fence. I'd love to get your take on why have you gone down the acquire capability as a whole agency route versus we need a new CRM play, we're going to hire a CRM partner, for want of a better word?
I think it's a really good question. And I would just caveat it a little bit that we have also over time added niche capabilities in the sort of probably another overused word of kind of acqui-hire way, of where we have brought in a team of 3 or 4 people, and sometimes it's been a pure hiring, sometimes it's been a mini acquisition, and some of those have worked really well. And so our media business in the UK, Walk-in Media, essentially we sort of brought Simon Davison, who used to run Blue 449 and Walk-in Media, and he's built that up behind him, and then actually we then acquired a business to kind of add scale to that. So I fundamentally believe that you've got to look at what's the strategy and what you're trying to achieve, and then kind of align what you're doing and the solution is kind of behind it. But probably the big thing is, in that a lot of certainly the marketing world, but I think it's also true in many parts of the consulting world, is that it's quite hard to be credible with 4 or 5 people, certainly when you're pitching and serving large multinational accounts. And I think a lot of acquisitions, even medium-sized acquisitions, do give you that instant scale and credibility. And secondly, as I say, for us as a business, we sort of had a mantra quite early on that we wanted to, at the minimum, now gone a long way past it, frankly, thankfully, build agencies that had kind of 5 million in revenue, 1 million of profit, and that enabled you to kind of sort of deal with the classic agency phrase of being 3 phone calls away from disaster type thing, by having a more balanced business. So that was probably one of the reasons. But we still try and kind of come back to sort of, what problem are we trying to solve and what's the best solution to do that? Is it hiring an individual? Is it an acqui-hire? Is it an acquisition? And we're definitely deploying the third sort of more so than we were sort of 10 years ago, but we're not doing it kind of exclusively.
Well, I think a really helpful rounded perspective. And I'm just curious, because you mentioned it, there's those 3 options and they're the same whether you're a marketing services or a consulting business. Do you find, and there might not be a rule of thumb, but do you find there's certain instances where you lean towards a person versus an acquisition? For anyone listening, is there something that actually that's best served by, a 5 million rev, 1 million EBIT agency acquisition versus an acqui-hire versus a, partner and build the practice?
I would say, as you say, it's not a one size fits all, but what we've found, if it's a very niche capability within a broader capability, if that kind of makes sense, then I think the acqui-hire or the individual route is generally the better way to go. If you are actually looking to, we want to get into this area. So for instance, had we've decided sort of rather than buying MMT that we really wanted to push into the more tech strategy and sort of engineering and cloud development, as opposed to more web design and build that we had previously, I think that would have been very hard to do with hiring individuals, because I think you need a level of breadth of capability to deliver on that. You need a sort of certain level of scale to convince clients, certainly enterprise level clients, and frankly you just need a level of kind of capability and skill set in even individuals within that is probably quite hard to get with just a series of hiring. So that, I think that's probably certainly our experience, and I think in many cases that's true, although I'm sure there are exceptions that prove the rule as well.
No, definitely. And there's something I think, and this will come in more depth when we dig into culture, but you hear a lot of stories about acquisitions, and every so often McKinsey, your alma mater, will put out a report about how many acquisitions fail, or these are the things that make them succeed. And as someone who's actually done a whole ton of these, what are those? You mentioned part of it is you need to know what you're looking to acquire and the capability, but I suspect you've talked to a lot more firms than you've actually acquired or acqui-hired. What are the things that you look out for? And for anyone listening, hearing this thing, actually, I want to acquire a capability or another agency, they should be looking out for, I guess, good and bad. What are the kind of, this could be a great fit, and what are the red flags that make you run a mile?
No, I think it's a really good question. And I think, it depends a bit on the size of the acquisition, but I think there are perhaps general lessons around it. And then ultimately, for us is that, people maybe haven't done this so much, sort of think you start from the numbers and the clients and sort of what's the shape of the deal and things like that. I mean, fundamentally, what I'm always looking for is kind of, what are the motivations of the people who are actually looking to sort of sell or join the group. And, for us still now, there's normally maximum of, say, 10 people who are the senior leaders of the agency or business we're looking to acquire, who maybe have the most kind of financial stake in it, and sort of, really understanding what those guys are looking to do is absolutely key, and try and do that quite early on. And particularly for us, what we're looking for is genuinely people who want to stay within the group and see an opportunity of growing faster than within the group than they can on their own. And if we don't get that, at least from a kind of core of the management team, it's quite hard for us to actually decide that it's the right acquisition for us. And so one of the things we do and we tend to find is that, try and put we have a pretty disciplined methodology and sort of type of offer structures that we might put in place. We try and do that quite early on, because my experience is that on the way in, everyone says, oh yeah, it's all about the long term, it's all about growth, etc. And then kind of, actually, if you kind of offer only 30% of the total value up front and the rest of it in shares or etc., those of them who really just want to sort of sell the business for as much as they can and exit stage left kind of tend to get found out quite quickly.
I think a great piece of advice there of actually, get to those numbers quite quickly, because you will find that out. And it's a really interesting point, that long-term piece. And I think you've alluded to it, but just for our listeners, is that for you a typical deal structure? It's incentivizing management for the long term so that you have those aligned interests, as opposed to, let's say, here's a pot of cash, we'll see you later in 2 years.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. I've just actually recently gone back and looked at the deals we've done over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. And while I always say our typical structure, which it is, if you generalize it, is kind of, 1/3 of kind of cash up front, 1/3 of kind of either deferred or earn out type structure, and then at least 1/3 of what we call roll. So either into pure equity or a mixture of kind of loan notes and equity. The funny thing is that no deal has actually quite had that structure, but the principles are there. And what we would never do is we would never buy a business where more than just over 1/3 was kind of just completely committed on conditional cash up front. And then secondarily, the most important piece is there's got to be a material part of kind of equity participation in the ongoing managers to some degree. And they've got to really see the value in doing that. And so every deal we've done has kind of brought people significantly into the MSQ share scheme, as I say, and actually that's been a significant part of the overall package. And the great thing for me is that, actually for someone who wants to do what they said they want to do, it then gives them the opportunity to not only kind of get value for the business at the time, but also increase that with the value of the share price, hopefully in MSQ going up over time. So if you really want to do that and you're true to what you say, there should be a really powerful motivation. If in reality, which is a perfectly sensible and fine thing, you actually want to sort of stay for a year and a half and then go do something different, you probably don't want to deal with that structure.
No, I think it's a great way, like you say, to uncover those true motives. And it's interesting to our conversation around where you started with McKinsey. There are quite a lot of corollaries with that consulting partner, equity partner model, build the firm together, that, like you say, you just don't get if it's cash up front or 2 years cash and then off. It's a very different culture you build. So, Pete, I think this takes us quite nicely onto culture. And if it pulls us back, you sort of do. But I think something that I'm interested in, again, this is very much for our consulting listeners, because it's quite uncommon in a consulting space, is we talked earlier about there is the MSQ brand and there are the agency brands underneath. And this might flow on from the acquisition piece. But, common, if you pick up a business school book, it says, have a brand, absorb, it's the kind of Accenture model, isn't it? Everything becomes Accenture. You've, I guess, deliberately done almost the opposite or had that balance. And I'd love to understand, almost it's a twofold, of why have you taken that two-level of brands approach, the individual agencies at MSQ? And I guess there's a side point of how do you decide who to keep as a standalone agency? You mentioned merging some earlier. How do you decide which ones to merge as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think for us fundamentally, and I believed this in 2012, and I believe it still now, is that our focus of, it comes back to the client centricity point, is that kind of I wanted to offer clients flexibility and choice. And there's been too much talk certainly in marketing communications, probably in professional services, of saying like we have the perfect model for clients. If I look at the world of universe that we kind of serve, we serve Unilever on an international basis, and we serve sort of medium-sized kind of smaller companies in the UK, and we really like the ability that we can kind of do both. And it was sort of pretty clear early on that kind of someone like Unilever hires us for specific things. They want us to do design and branding and maybe into comms for an individual brand, and then sort of Diageo tend to hire us for more kind of our own media capability. The last thing either those two want saying we can do all of your marcoms across every brand, including media and etc., because they provide that integration and that sort of coordination. And then at an MSQ level, where the sort of probably our biggest level of growth, however, is in a more digitally driven and kind of performance marketing world, you do need to have that kind of more joined up team, probably even more so than the past. And so for kind of other clients, particularly if you've got kind of it started off for people who had a marketing team of 4 or 5, when it was much harder to kind of bring all that together, managing 7 agencies across the piece. And so really that's why we said, well, actually what we're going to do is kind of create different front doors, and clients can kind of almost walk through whichever front door is most appropriate to them as an individual client. And in a way, I would argue that's much more client-centric than having the perfect model kind of for clients. So that was always the thinking and kind of remains the thinking. I think what's interesting on the kind of CMO marketing side of the house is that actually as you move to a world of kind of more digital focused communications, is actually having the specialisms is actually more important than ever. Because if you're doing a sort of global campaign that, yes, has a creative platform and single strategy, but delivers across all social channels as well as earned media and etc., you need the specialist in Snapchat who understands what works, and the specialist in kind of Instagram, and you don't get that from the kind of the generalists alongside it. And then probably the last point, which actually probably hits the cultural one more sort of bang on, is that what we've found at least is that people prefer to be kind of recruited and join an individual capability. They love the fact that it's part of a broader group and it creates opportunities, but actually that we're particularly now able to recruit higher quality people because they're joining something in an area they know, they can see the bounds, they can see and touch the culture, rather than something that's maybe a bit more amorphous.
I think some fascinating points, and I hadn't expected to go here, but your point around client centricity and those different front doors, it's really interesting, and I think carries across to consulting really well, because we work a lot in the boutique consulting space, and actually the easy sell if you are a boutique consultancy is like you said, we're specialist, we're not the big four, we're not generalist. But to exactly your point, sometimes larger clients, they need that breadth, and having those different front doors makes a lot of sense. If someone walks through the MSQ front door because it's a global campaign, they need that integrated approach. You've got that, but the same vice versa. It sounds like it works very well, but some of my listeners are skeptical. So I'm going to ask it for them. Does it ever create confusion with clients or tension? And I guess how do you manage that if someone walks through the MSQ front door, but actually they wanted the MMT front door and they didn't realize it?
Yeah, I think the second point is easier to answer in the sense that I think, what we try and do is in discussion with the clients in the sense is it's not quite as simple as them just walking through the front door and going, is that you think what is the right setup for them? And if necessarily, having that discussion with them. So I'm sure we've made mistakes on that, but I feel like we probably get that right more often than not. And sometimes it's about culture as well, to put in that some people like that within a single agency brand. Some people love the idea of a bespoke team of specialists. But I think on the other side of things, it probably has been more of a challenge. And if I think back to when we first launched the MSQ offer on top or alongside the agency offer, I think there was a massive sort of feeling from a lot of clients, this is complex, it's going to be hard to access, it's not going to live up to its promise, because I think people have been a bit once bitten type shy around that. So there were definitely opportunities that we didn't convert because everyone just felt, well, actually this is a complex thing. And one of the things is when you put up now 11 brand names, it does look complicated. And I guess, we sort of learned a bit along the way. And if it's more likely to be an MSQ piece, I tend to deliberately talk much more about capabilities and downplay the individual brands. And probably the biggest thing for us is actually getting clients into the agency and that they then see, well, actually, you don't have walls between kind of your individual capabilities. People are, walking around talking to each other and know each other. So actually, it kind of makes a lot more sense for us. If you see it on a PowerPoint chart, again, it's probably does look more complicated.
No, you're quite right. And yes, having been to your office, like you say, when you see it, it just looks like one team. But yeah, if you see on a PowerPoint slide, we're going to put these 11 agencies together. Anyone who's ever managed multiple suppliers suddenly probably has a heart attack at that.
Absolutely.
And I think the team side's, again, fascinating because something I know from myself and I hear from friends who've worked in consulting and marketing's no different is some people like the big agencies, big cultures. Some people like those boutiques. And actually that fascinating blend of, well, you are part of a small tribe, if you like, it's a bit crude, but the analogy is almost like you've got these little towns in a country, don't you? And this might come back to the type of people you hire, but you talked about it at a leadership team level, and there's incentivization that enables people to kind of see the bigger picture. How do you balance those different cultures so that they do truly feel different and independent at the agency level, but actually throughout, from the most junior person upwards, there is that consistent MSQ feel? Is it just the physical location and sort of bringing everyone together for like the drinks where we saw each other before Christmas? Or is there other things that you've really had to focus on to do deliberately?
I think the co-location is a big difference. I mean, what I would say is, and I've sort of tried not to force this, is that I think you need to look at certainly the geographic context, and in that it definitely we are more joined up in single culture in London, where all of the capabilities are present in the building and elsewhere. In Leeds, where we have sort of an agency called 26, has been super successful for 10 years and sort of ultimately kind of performance marketing and web design and build, until recently when MMT also joined. They were sort of on their own in that place. And while they did collaborate with kind of other parts of the group, it was less so than kind of the average within the London teams. And so in a sense, they had a bit more 26-ness and a bit less MSQ-ness. And I always thought that was kind of fine. And it's sort of, probably continued as a bit of an evolution rather than a fixed piece. So I think kind of for me, at least as another sort of person, accepting that is probably quite important. But then when I look at London, I feel like actually there are absolutely sort of common threads that sit across them, and are probably, the agencies might not use the same words to describe their culture, but actually the underpinning values are all the same. And I think kind of, I look and I don't see a huge difference in terms of kind of, you wouldn't even be able to work out, I think, looking at people or speaking to people, which agency they're from, unless it was kind of made clear to you.
Yeah, well, as I say, having been to your office, I couldn't tell in a good way. And I think that example is fascinating, that sort of 26-ness, actually the different location. I always remember back to my consulting days, and there's a business around the corner from here actually, where there was different cultures on floors and actually physical barriers seem to be the biggest blocker to culture of anything.
I think one of the weird things that I've learned and we've learned over the years is that actually just not having people on different floors. When we were at our previous office, we sort of made the decision, we only had them on 2 floors, but we kind of brought everyone together. And one of the real attractions of our current office was having kind of, while there are 2 floors, having a single staircase in the middle that just joins the 2 floors. Everyone has to walk up, coming and lift the same way, because unfortunately, otherwise people just settle into habits of kind of going to their floor, sending emails to their colleague downstairs, and you don't get that interaction.
No, you're spot on. So I smile because I remember the people on the 3rd floor talked about the people on the ground floor like they were a different species of animal, not least just a different colleague on a different floor.
So I was talking to someone on Wednesday who used to work at Dentsu in Japan, and he was saying that they have 72 floors of a building in Tokyo. So wow. That must be a challenge.
Yes, what 72 think of one and vice versa must be fascinating. And there's something, I guess this is another part of culture that we talked about, the acquisition from a kind of commercial perspective and the business functions you're looking to acquire, the capabilities. There's an interesting element to our conversation around culture there as well, because I think it's the same in Marcoms as it is in consulting. These are people businesses. The downside from an acquisition perspective of people businesses is they can walk out the door tomorrow. And obviously having co-location, et cetera, helps once everyone's in the building. I'd love to know actually how you've honed that approach to give people, I guess, a soft landing. So if you're dropping into the group from a different agency, how you do that in a way that retains people so that they stay and also feel part of the group culture and their own culture?
Yeah, I think sort of there's probably it's relevant for hiring and acquisitions again, isn't it? But I think probably the other thing and I think it's particularly in a acquisition context, but I think it is more broadly, is spending time with people beforehand and being kind of open and honest and transparent about the kind of, the pros and cons that generally exist. So I sort of like to think from kind of both cases that certainly at a senior level, if we're bringing someone in, they've had the opportunity to meet 10, 15 people within the kind of group, and not just the sort of senior sort of people and the MSQ exec directors, but someone else who's joined, has sold their group in and decided to stay, and or someone who's kind of played a similar role, and they get the chance to get the kind of, if there is one, a warts and all version of everything. And similarly, I think, so the same thing is true that slightly coming back to acquisitions, I always believe that there's something is going to go wrong or not going to feel the way it was promised 6 months in. And so if you kind of just give people as clear a view of what it's going to be like, on the way in as you can, you minimize the chance of that being a serious issue kind of down the line.
No, I think it's a great point. Like you say, this being honest, and then people can decide. It's better for them to know everything and decide it's not for them before it starts than to massage that and they come in and it's not quite what they thought, isn't it?
100%. I mean, I think the worst thing in any kind of senior hiring or any hiring in any acquisition is that 6 months later, both of you or either of you think it's not the right thing, because then ultimately you both lose on the back of it.
Definitely. And I want to turn now to actually, I guess, a very different topic, but something I know you're hugely passionate about, or 2 topics actually, because obviously ahead of this conversation, we were talking about sort of areas that you're passionate about, that MSQ is passionate about. And I know both sustainability and diversity and inclusion are 2 areas that you're really passionate about. And this might be a good place for us to start. You made the point that actually the marketing and Marcoms space is a little bit further ahead than if you think of our kind of traditional management consulting industry. Obviously, we have a lot of consultants listening. I'd love to start by actually getting your take on why you believe that, and almost what is it that Marcoms is doing that puts it ahead of, say, that traditional consulting space?
So I certainly think it's generally true. And I think for me, the 2 big reasons why, actually, in a very positive way, is that they're kind of driven by staff and clients. And that's what sort of really spurred people into action, with a few champions within the community. And so, I think from a particularly, say, a sustainability and a DE&I point of view, that, staff in certainly all levels within the group, if we're not seen to be taking this seriously and we're not seen to be championing doing the right thing, they don't want to come and work at somewhere like MSQ, etc. So that was always a real pressure. And alongside that, from particularly, I would say initially from a DE&I point of view, that the clients recognize that actually they're marketing to a real cross section of the UK global population. And you've got to have kind of a team that largely represents your consumers ultimately, or clients. clients to really maximize the effectiveness of your advertising, your marketing. So I think those two things as an industry have kind of, have spurred people into action. It's not just pure altruism on the back of it. And, for us having, a couple of people who've really felt passionately about that and were able to kind of, devote significant time to it was probably also a real driver on the back of it. So those are probably the big things. But, I must caveat that going back to the last time I went to a McKinsey event, I mean, to be fair, that they have with the new sort of global senior partner, they've put sustainability in theory at the heart of everything they're kind of doing. I think it's sort of, early days and we'll see how it plays out in practice. But I think it's been caught up and I think it's fantastic that an organization like that has taken that kind of stance, because if they don't, we won't really drive the level of change that needs to occur. In terms of sort of actually practically doing things, and we can maybe delve into a bit more. I think that, a lot of it means on the sustainability side, it's actually just making initially real commitments of what you're going to do as an organization, frankly, and then obviously seeing them through. And then from the E&I, it's actually about being really clear about what you want to achieve. And then again, kind of putting in a plan in place to do that.
It's a great point. And like you say, I think let's dig in, because it's both topics are really poignant, and it might be we need to break them out for this, but how have you sort of set those goals, those plans? Because the sustainability, or both sustainability and DEI, almost there's so much you could achieve. In some ways, it's setting both a realistic goal, but also sort of defining where you can have success, not trying to change, sustainability. You're not going to change everything overnight. How have you approached that MSQ to give you that plan and that roadmap? Yeah, no,
I think it's, really good points and a really good question on the back of it. I think from a sustainability point of view, the first thing we did, and actually, it sounds like a consulting thing, but I think it really is true for everyone, is actually you've got to get the kind of measurement process in place, because you can't really make any commitments if you actually firstly don't know where you're effectively creating emissions and how much, and et cetera, and then you certainly can't set meaningful targets on the back of it. So I would really, even for sort of small, medium-sized businesses, sort of James Canning's our Chief Sustainability Officer. He runs a brilliant course on Beamer that kind of tells and helps agencies take the first steps kind of along the way. So, I think, that really important, and it still is really important. One of the things that I found really helpful in going back probably 3-4 years ago, where we really embarked on this journey, was also recognizing that actually the investment required is not as huge as you think. So I think that does put off some people, understandably, in terms of that most small and medium-sized businesses, as we were and still are to many degrees, you can't just invest 100,000 quid in something that with perhaps an uncertain return. And actually, you could start to make a real difference with you still need to make a commitment, but a relatively modest investment. And so having kind of got those two things in place, really, the first thing we did was to make a concrete commitment to cut our emissions per head by 50% within 3 years. We've subsequently gone a bit further than that, and ultimately would encourage people to kind of look at science-based targets and then ultimately make a form of kind of, net zero, or sort of almost statements and objectives, but probably then have some building blocks along the way, so it's not too far off and doesn't feel too unachievable. No, I think a great sort of answer. And just so I can get science-based metrics, as in you mentioned emissions, something that's measurable in kind of CO2 terms. Is that kind of what you're... It is, but science-based targets as well as an organisation, it's a little bit like B Corp in the sense that they will provide you a level of validation as well, and ultimately they'll kind of help drive towards net zero now. And is that the same on the DEI side, sort of setting those objectives? And you mentioned, and I'm fascinated that sort of investment isn't as big as people think. How does that play out as well on that DEI side? Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think we had a really interesting touch on this over lunch as well. That I think it's similar but different. I think, and it took us longer to, get this more on track with DE&I. Is that you've got to be clear on what your priorities are. And I think, slightly bizarrely, I think too many organizations now still, because the easiest things to measure is your gender and ethnicity mix, and that's important things, important to do, etc. But it's only part of the story. And I think we both kind of agree that ultimately you need to build in genuine diversity of kind of background, diversity of thought, etc. And that's actually a harder thing to do in terms of setting objectives that you can then kind of see through. And so for us, it was actually took a little bit of time within the DEI Council, getting the council kind of set up with the right representation that has a degree of kind of overall championship at different levels of the organization, but actually it's got to be built bottom up. But then we kind of fixed on kind of 4 priorities, which did include sort of in some cases sort of gender balance and ethnicity, but actually kind of went beyond that in terms of really having specific objectives and techniques to build that broader level of diversity, which I think is absolutely critical.
No, definitely. And yes, as we were talking about at lunch, personally, I'm a big advocate of social mobility. And just because I can, if anyone here has space for 5 to 10 work experience students from deprived backgrounds this summer, I'm looking to find 30 of them work experience in our industry that could change their lives. So please do drop me a message. And I think your point around actually finding those that you mentioned there, Pete, those initiatives within the kind of, you've got the D&I Council, you've got the measures, and you started to actually do some things that are bearing fruit. Just because I always love diving into the detail, what are some of those things that have had the most success for you in that D&I space, those kind of initiatives that actually been like, wow, that really has moved us forwards?
I think actually one of the things, which I know a lot of bigger organizations have done, but actually just having kind of almost interest groups within it. So, we now have we have a kind of, we've just been launched this week, WSQ, which is kind of women's group at MSQ. We have a kind of a broader sort of movement for different other kind of interests where they can sort of spend time with each other. And sort of some ways you get things that are perhaps not entirely intuitively coming out of the back of it. So, this week when we launched WSQ, we had the kind of technical director on the female side of the FA come and talk, did a fantastic speech around it. And one of her messages is that actually, as well as kind of all these things where we need to think about equality and setting common standards, is you also need to recognize that kind of the different genders are different. And so for her in the Lionesses journey, actually, it was actually about not being trying to set everything up in the same way as kind of the male team. And that was a key part of their success. And I think, that's also, what we all took away was really interesting in a kind of business context and stuff. There are absolutely things you need to kind of level playing fields, create common standards, etc. But you also need to kind of put things in place for everyone that recognizes where there are differences, that makes their kind of, their life sort of easier, makes their kind of career more rewarding. And so that's been for me a really interesting thing that perhaps we haven't done as well as kind of, I think some of the more social initiatives, a little bit like the one I think brilliantly putting forward, have also started to make a difference.
I think a really good point. And actually that FA piece, I'm no expert on this topic, but it comes back to that sort of equality versus equity debate, doesn't it? Of equality is everyone has the same policies, procedures, but to your point, men are different from women. And actually, is that equitable if women are all following the way men do it? Because, they're very different. And those interest groups as well, I guess, like myself with social mobility, you're giving people an avenue to their passion, and actually change starts with a passion. It comes back to why you joined Media Square all the way back. There was that passion to do something different. And it's the same on the DEI space.
No, I think that's really, and I would say not particularly by design particularly, but in some ways we've done more, probably initiated more things centrally from a sustainability point of view, certainly kind of targets and things like that. But actually the most interesting things from DE&I point of view tended to be almost sort of bottom up, and sort of someone's passion has kind of created a link with a brilliant organization that helps from social mobility. And then that brings into more of a kind of apprenticeship style scheme on the back of it.
Amazing. Well, Pete, we've covered a ton of ground, and I'm very conscious you have a busy day after this. I know you've got calls coming up. So I'm going to draw us to a close, and I've got a last couple of questions that I ask all of my guests, and I am fascinated about both the similarities and differences in these. So the first one is about books, and I should caveat, not everyone reads books. I don't know if you do. So if the answer is not books, I'm interested as well. But the question is, what is the book or books that you've gifted or have had the biggest impact on you, and why is that?
Yeah, no, funny enough, this was the one I was probably most worried about, because I'm not a big business book reader or etc. But it was interesting to think about it. And on the very rare occasions that I have gifted a couple of books over certainly the last 20 years, the two that stand out, and actually there's a nice parallel with them as well, is that, one of which is very much back of the McKinsey days, is that The Pyramid Principle, which was by Barbara Minto, I think is a really good, anyone who's going to, has to write stuff, even analyze stuff in the future, I think it is a great thing, but only read the first chapter, because it does live up to its name, and it does actually sort of define the key points on the first chapter, and you don't need to wade through the rest of it. And the second one is completely different, but actually sort of initially it was something I was given by James Cannings, our Chief Sustainability Officer, and then sort of passed on to other people. But there's a book called The Uninhabitable Earth, which just sort of frames at least a potential future in there. Again, I would recommend only reading the first chapter. You get a good sense of the whole thing. So those are are probably the two that I'd say. So interestingly, at MSQ, there's been more giving and receiving of records than books, which I've also kind of quite liked.
And records as in 12 inches?
Yeah, 12 on 9 inches.
Sorry, yeah,
7.
At 7. I can tell you're an aficionado when you bring up 7 inches. What's the record that's been gifted most?
So
and why?
It's very bizarre, and this is going to be very niche, but actually it's a record by the Sultans of Ping FC, which is called Where's My Jumper, which has been both shared in both 7 and 12 inches.
I feel I've got to ask, why that record?
It's quite a niche indie record, which sort of one of our kind of creative director in Belfast also kind of shared a passion as with I did, and so that was the kind of initial link, as well as kind of weirdly in one of our former agencies had a record collection in it, of which there was one of the Sons of Ping's albums as well, or EPs.
I love that, the things you learn, and to your point around books, I do think I need to update this question for today as well, because I increasingly have guests who, like yourself, books aren't the thing. It's podcasts, it's YouTube, it's 7 or 12 inches. I'll be honest, you're the first guest who'd answered with records, but the books as well are fantastic. And I think your point is not lost on anyone who reads business books. There's a lot of books where you can get 95% from that first chapter. And I think the pyramid principle is one of those things that a lot of people in business just should read and learn. The ability to tell stories. I mean, it comes back to, what we do in marketing, doesn't it? It's telling stories, getting those key points across quickly. It's so powerful, but I'm never sure if it's because it's got a McKinsey badge, people think it's a bit scary, or what it is, but it's such a powerful book.
Oh, no, I think you're right. And I think there is a little bit of that. And, in theory, you probably think it's a slightly more dry sort of topic than it might be, but I completely agree. And I look now at some of the people coming through in a way where they're less used to doing is actually kind of, every presentation is very deductive, and it's going through and actually sort of, sometimes you need to kind of hit the key messages up front and then kind of build behind them.
Well, and I think in today's world where, everyone always asks, what's the shortest in the TikTok generation? Actually, that pyramid principle is perfect for TikTok, isn't it? And actually bringing those old ideas to the fore. History always repeats, as we see with 12 inches.
I was just wondering, I'm not sure Barbara Minto would probably imagine herself as the TikTok generation.
You never know. I will go and see if I'll find her on TikTok after this. And the very last question, Pete, and this, again, it might be a recap of some of the things we've discussed. It might be a new point, but you have 3 people in front of you. And I'll let you take this, be it for, your colleagues today in the Marcoms world or consulting, but you have someone who's just started their career, that sort of first graduate job. You've got someone who, my long-standing listeners must get frustrated with me because I always change this, but kind of middle of their 20s, 5, 6 years in, they've done enough to have options. They've got a bit of a specialism, but they're not senior yet. And then the final person is, in consulting terms, what I say is someone approaching partner. It might be someone at MSQ who's about to take on running an agency or a senior, client relationship. And the question is, what one piece of advice would you give to each of them?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably take a consulting angle on that one, actually, because I think there are some interesting lessons, certainly in, not lessons, but sort of applying my experience that I really think when you start off, the real benefit I got from consulting, and I think a lot of people got from consulting is that breadth of experience you get. I still think there's nothing you can do where you kind of get to learn about as many industries, meet people in different settings. And so, I mean, it's an obvious thing, but I do think just doing as much as you can. And, all I mean by that is that sometimes you start working with the same group of people and you carry on doing the same things. In the first few years, I think that's more of a mistake because I think you don't necessarily know what you're going to enjoy. And I think it's kind of often not what you might expect on the way in. And then I think as you get sort of, certainly kind of up sort of close towards partner, I think probably the mid stage, I think it's probably about really at that point, start to figure out, what you want to do and kind of, don't get sort of too necessarily swept up in the traditional career ladder and et cetera. Do take a bit of time out in what's normally a busy experience to think about, what's right for you, what you want to do kind of, more medium term and long term. And that sort of then segues into this is a very similar thing, but it's probably becomes more stark because I think you really do have in most consulting firms, certainly it was true in McKinsey, but I think it's probably true in most places that period before partner, you need to really commit on so many levels. In the stage beforehand, you really probably have to put more of your life and stuff into making that stage for the benefit that kind of comes down the line, and just be really sure that you've thought about that's what you want to do versus other opportunities and versus what you get kind of down the line. And for many people, it's kind of worthwhile. But it's, one of the things with the consulting is that the career path in theory, it's not very well defined in the early years, but it is very defined when you get to that, much more than in a bigger organization in some ways. So I think just taking that time to kind of, figure out before you then either commit to it and go for it, or you go and do something different would be my advice. Probably slightly longer than it should have been.
No, I think some great points. And actually that last point around, do you just stop and think? Because it can seem very easy to, that's the next goal. But if that's going to be your career or your life for the next 10 years, is that actually what you want? And I think, as you're a great example of, you did some of that thinking a bit earlier in your career, decided I want to do something different. And I think as well have shown that there's more ways to succeed than just make partner in a large consulting firm. But you need to think about that before you're almost trapped into a career that you hadn't thought about.
100%.
So, Pete, this has been fantastic. It's been great to have lunch before this, obviously, and really enjoyed the conversation. The only last thing to ask is, if anyone wants to find out more about yourself, they want to find out more about MSQ, where would you point them to? Where can they get in touch?
Sure. I mean, I'd sort of, certainly for me, sort of LinkedIn is probably the best thing, because it's also got kind of links into MSQ and et cetera. And sort of, my LinkedIn handle is linkedin.com/in/Peter-Reid, REID, and then one at the end. And then from an MSQ point of view, there's a few things, but sort of certainly msqpartners.com is a decent starting point. But for those people, say, interested in sustainability, we did sort of publish our first sustainability annual report this year as well, which you can kind of dive into as well. But I thought that'll give you a few good ideas about some initiatives you might be able to put in place.
Amazing. Well, Pete, I think thank you for all of those. I'll also include links to those in the show notes. So anyone listening, if you go to the show notes, you will find Pete's bio, Pete's LinkedIn, the website, and also the sustainability report, so people can dive into those. And all that's left to say, Pete, is thank you. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope you have a great weekend.
And thank you very much, Nick. It's been great.
Cheers. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Climbing Consulting. If you have any guest recommendations, comments, ideas, thoughts on how I can make this show better for you, just drop me an email. It's nick@createengage.co.uk, and I really look forward to hearing from you.